There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, moments that are, in truth, the quiet turning of a key in a lock you never knew was there. For me, that moment smelled of laundry detergent and the faint, clean scent of rain on pavement. It was the weight of another person's arm draped across my chest, a casual, sleeping gesture that held the gravity of a tectonic shift. His name was Alex, and he was asleep in my bed, a place he had occupied on and off for 3 months, always with a chasm of carefully preserved space between us. But on that night, in the deep, silent hours before dawn, he had rolled over and closed the distance. The barrier we had both tacitly constructed, the invisible wall of friendship and fear, had been breached by a single, unconscious movement. And I lay there, utterly still, listening to the rhythm of his breathing, feeling the warmth of him bleed through my t-shirt, and I understood with a terrifying, exhilarating clarity that nothing would ever be the same again. The air in the room felt different, charged with the weight of a question that had been whispered into the space between us, a question that had been hanging there for 10 years. We met in the way that so many people do in their late teens, thrown together by the arbitrary architecture of university life. I was assigned a photography project for my introductory arts course, Capture an Unguarded Moment. I spent days wandering the campus, my old film camera feeling like a clumsy, foreign object in my hands, trying to find something that felt true. Everything looked posed. Everyone seemed aware of the potential for observation. Then I found the aquatic center. The air inside was heavy and warm, thick with the smell of chlorine that clung to the back of your throat. It was a world of its own, echoing with the rhythmic splash and pull of bodies cutting through water. And that's where I first saw him. Alex. He was not just swimming. He was a part of the water, an extension of its power. He moved with a fluid, relentless grace that was mesmerizing. He was all long limbs and coiled strength, his focus so absolute that the world outside his lane simply ceased to exist. I watched him for nearly an hour, hidden in the empty spectator stands, feeling like a spy. When he finally hauled himself from the pool, slick and glistening under the fluorescent lights, he was laughing with a teammate, his face open and bright. That was the moment. I raised my camera, the focus ring grinding softly, and I pressed the shutter. The resulting photograph became the centerpiece of my portfolio. It was technically imperfect, the light was harsh, the focus a little soft, but it had life. It had captured him in that brief, breathless instant between exertion and relief. The unguarded moment. I pinned it to the board for critique, my stomach churning with a strange mix of pride and anxiety. When he saw it a week later, walking past the art building with some friends, he stopped dead. I was nearby, pretending to read a flyer, my heart hammering against my ribs. I watched him lean in, his brow furrowed, and then a slow smile spread across his face. He didn't seem angry or violated. He seemed seen. He found out my name from the exhibition card, and the next day, he found me in the campus coffee shop. He slid into the chair opposite me, dripping a little from a morning practice, his hair still damp. He just said, "That picture. You made me look like I know what I'm doing." I remember stammering something about the light being good, and he just laughed, a loud, easy sound that made people at other tables look over. That was the beginning. It was that simple. A photograph, a conversation, a shared cup of coffee that stretched into 2 hours. Our friendship formed in the spaces between our two very different worlds. His was a world of stopwatches and early mornings, of aching muscles, and the relentless pursuit of a fraction of a second. Mine was a world of darkrooms and quiet observation, of waiting for the right light, of trying to distill a feeling into a single frame. He was motion, I was stillness. He was the subject, I was the observer. Yet we fit. He would drag me out of my solitary bubble to team parties, introducing me with a proprietary arm around my shoulders as Leo, the artist. I, in turn, provided a quiet harbor for him, a place where he wasn't Alex the swimmer, the competitor, but just Alex. My small, cluttered apartment became his refuge from the pressures of his sport and the boisterous energy of his teammates. He would sprawl on my lumpy sofa, exhausted after a meet, and talk for hours about everything and nothing. The frustrating politics of team relays, the girl from his calculus class he thought was cute, his secret fear that he was peaking too early. I learned to listen, to simply provide a space for him to unfold. It was in those quiet, unassuming moments that my feelings for him began to take root, silently and invisibly, like a vine growing in the dark. It wasn't a sudden lightning strike. It was a slow, creeping dawn. It was the way his eyes would crinkle at the corners when he genuinely smiled. It was the unconscious habit he had of running a hand through his perpetually damp hair. It was the earnest, almost childlike way he would describe the feeling of a perfect race, his hands carving through the air as if it were water. I started to see him not just as a friend, but as a landscape I wanted to explore, a study in light and shadow that I could spend a lifetime documenting. I photographed him often, using him as a subject for my projects. He was a natural model, unself-conscious and trusting. But for every one photo I showed him, there were 10 I kept for myself. Portraits of him sleeping on my couch, the afternoon sun tracing the line of his jaw, a shot of his hands, strong and capable, resting on a textbook. These images were my secret language, a confession I could never speak aloud. They were my way of saying, "I see you," in a way that went far beyond that first photograph. For 10 years, this was our dynamic. We navigated life after university, finding our footing in the adult world. He went into software consulting, a field that surprised everyone, but made sense when you understood his logical, methodical mind. I scraped by as a freelance photographer, shooting weddings and corporate headshots to pay the bills, while nurturing my personal projects in the quiet hours. We remained each other's constant. We were the emergency contacts, the default plus ones, the first call after a triumph or a disaster. He dated a series of bright, beautiful women. I had a few quiet, short-lived relationships of my own. We would talk about them, offer advice, provide shoulders to cry on. I became an expert at compartmentalizing. There was Alex, my best friend, the person I loved more than anyone. And then there was the other Alex, the one who lived in my photographs and in the silent, hopeful corners of my heart. The two rarely met. I built a fortress around that hope, its walls thick with the fear of ruining the most important relationship in my life. The unspoken rule was clear: we were friends. Brothers, even. To suggest anything more would be to detonate a bomb in the foundations of our world. So I stayed quiet, and I waited, without even knowing what I was waiting for. The shift began on a Tuesday in October. It was a day of relentless, miserable rain, the kind that seeps into your bones and turns the city gray. He called me from his car, his voice sounding hollow and distant over the speaker. "She ended it," he said, just like that. No preamble. He was talking about Sarah, the woman he'd been with for nearly 2 years, the one everyone, including me, thought he would marry. I told him to come over. When he arrived, he looked smaller than I'd ever seen him, as if the news had physically compressed him. He stood dripping in my entryway, his usual vibrant energy completely extinguished, leaving behind a hollowed-out stillness. He didn't want to talk about it, not really. He just wanted to be. He sat on my couch and stared at the rain-streaked window while I made tea, the silence in the apartment thick and heavy. That night, he fell asleep there, still in his damp clothes, his head at an awkward angle against the armrest. I found a blanket and gently covered him, my fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second before I tucked it around his shoulders. I watched him for a long time, his face in sleep looking young and vulnerable, the confident mask he wore for the world completely gone. In that moment, he wasn't Alex the successful consultant or Alex the former star athlete. He was just a man whose heart was broken, and my own heart ached with a fierce, protective tenderness that was almost painful. It was a feeling so potent it scared me. It was more than friendship. I knew it, and the knowing of it in that moment felt like a dangerous liability. I wanted to smooth the worried crease between his eyebrows, to tell him that he was safe here, that I would hold the world at bay for him. But I did nothing. I just watched him breathe, and then I went to my own bed and lay awake for hours, listening to the rain and the sound of his quiet, troubled sleep in the next room. This was the catalyst. Sarah's departure left a void in his life, a gaping hole where a home used to be. He had practically lived at her place, and returning to his own sterile, bachelor apartment felt, in his words, like visiting a stranger, so he started showing up at mine. At first, it was just for dinner a few times a week. Then it became most nights. He'd arrive with takeout or groceries, his presence filling my quiet space with a low, comforting hum. We would eat, watch a movie, or just sit in companionable silence while I edited photos and he tapped away on his laptop. It was easy. It was comfortable. It felt like an extension of the friendship we'd always had, just intensified. But there was a new fragility to him that I hadn't seen before. He was adrift, and my apartment, my presence, had become his anchor. I was happy to be it, but a thread of anxiety was woven through the happiness. I was becoming his safe harbor, and I knew how dangerous it was to let my own heart mistake sanctuary for a shared home. The ritual began about a month after the breakup. It was late, past midnight, and we had been talking for hours. He was finally opening up about Sarah, not with anger, but with a deep, weary sadness. He spoke of the slow erosion of their relationship, the small misunderstandings that had calcified into insurmountable walls. As he talked, he grew heavier, his words slowing down until he was just staring into space. He scrubbed a hand over his face and sighed. "I don't think I can go home tonight," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The quiet is too loud." My own apartment was hardly a bastion of noise, but I understood what he meant. He meant the silence of absence. He meant the ghost of a shared life. "You can stay here," I said, the words feeling both completely natural and monumentally significant. "The couch is yours." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a gratitude so profound it almost broke my heart. "Thanks, Leo," he said. "Really." And so he stayed. That first night, I gave him a pillow and the thick quilt my grandmother had made. I retreated to my bedroom and closed the door, but I didn't lock it. I never locked it. I lay in the dark, my senses on high alert, cataloging the unfamiliar sounds of another person settling into the landscape of my home. The creak of the sofa springs, the soft thump of his shoes hitting the floor, the rustle of the quilt. It was an intimacy of proximity, a shared vulnerability in the darkness, and it felt both achingly sweet and deeply unsettling. I was acutely aware of him, just a thin wall and a few feet of air separating us. Every cell in my body seemed to be oriented towards the living room, listening. What started as a one-time offer soon became an unspoken routine. He never explicitly asked to stay over again, and I never explicitly invited him. It just happened. He would stay late. The energy would drain from the room, and one of us would make a quiet, non-committal statement about the time. I would get up and pull the quilt from the linen closet. He would take the pillows from the decorative shams on the couch. No discussion was needed. It became a ritual, a silent agreement. He would sleep on the couch, and I would sleep in my bed, the bedroom door always left slightly ajar. That open door became a symbol for me, a physical manifestation of the state of my own heart, not fully closed off, but not thrown wide open either. It was a space of possibility, a channel through which the sounds of his breathing could travel, a constant, reassuring reminder of his presence. Some nights, I would wake in the dark and pad out to the kitchen for a glass of water, my steps slow and careful so as not to wake him. I would see him there, a long shape under the quilt, illuminated by the pale blue glow of the streetlights filtering through the window. In these moments, my carefully constructed walls would feel thin as paper. The line between friend and something else would blur into an indistinct, hazy smudge. I would stand there, my hand on the cold countertop, and just watch him. I studied the way his hair fell across his forehead, the relaxed set of his jaw in sleep, the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest. This was a secret intimacy, a stolen closeness he was completely unaware of. It felt both sacred and transgressive. I was the keeper of his unconscious vulnerability, the silent guardian of his sleep. And in those quiet, pre-dawn hours, the love I had kept locked away for a decade would swell in my chest until it felt like I couldn't breathe. The nights on the couch continued through the fall and into the first chill of winter. The ritual became more entrenched, more necessary. His own apartment became little more than a place to store his clothes and get his mail. My home had become his. He started leaving a toothbrush in the bathroom, a spare hoodie in my closet. Each small act of domestic integration was like a stone dropped into the quiet pool of my heart, sending ripples of hope and fear out to the edges. Was this just an extension of our friendship, a practical arrangement born of his heartbreak and my loyalty? Or was it something more? I spent countless hours dissecting every gesture, every word, searching for meaning. When he'd smile at me over his morning coffee, was it just friendliness, or was there a deeper warmth in his eyes? When his hand brushed against mine as we reached for the same thing, was the lingering contact accidental or intentional? I was a detective searching for clues in a case where I was the only interested party, trying to solve a mystery that perhaps didn't even exist. The anxiety was a constant, low-grade hum beneath the surface of my days. I lived in a state of hyper-awareness whenever he was near. I was conscious of the space between our bodies, of the air we shared, of the subtle shifts in his mood that I could read like a barometer. This hypervigilance was exhausting. It was like holding a single, delicate note for months on end, my muscles trembling with the strain, waiting for the conductor to either signal the crescendo or cut the sound off completely. My photography suffered. I couldn't seem to find focus, literally or figuratively. Every subject felt flat, every composition meaningless. The only thing that felt real, the only thing that held any depth or color, was him. He had become the sun in my small universe, and I was just a planet caught in his orbit, my own light just a pale reflection of his. The first time he crossed the threshold of my bedroom was on a particularly cold night in December. A sudden, vicious snowstorm had descended on the city, rattling the windows and piling drifts against the door. The old radiator in my living room, always temperamental, had chosen that night to finally give up, hissing and clanking its way into a sullen silence. The apartment grew cold quickly. I gave him 2 extra blankets, but when I got up in the middle of the night, I found him shivering on the couch, curled into a tight ball. He was awake. He looked up at me, his teeth chattering slightly. "It's freezing out here, Leo," he whispered. My heart did a slow, painful somersault in my chest. There was only one other source of warmth in the apartment: my bed. The words felt like they were being dredged up from the bottom of the ocean. You can sleep in here," I said, my voice hoarse. I gestured towards my room. "It's warmer." I expected him to refuse, to make a joke, to insist he was fine. It was a line we had never even approached, let alone considered crossing. But he just looked at me, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "Okay," he said. He followed me into my bedroom, a ghost of a man wrapped in a cocoon of blankets. The room felt impossibly small with him in it. My bed, which had always felt spacious, suddenly seemed like a tiny raft in a vast, uncertain sea. I got in on my side, my back turned to him, my body rigid with tension. I heard him settle in behind me, the mattress dipping with his weight. The silence was deafening. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, a palpable presence in the cold air. We were inches apart, 2 separate islands in a sea of cotton sheets, the space between us charged with a voltage that made the hair on my arms stand up. I didn't sleep. I lay there for hours, my eyes wide open in the dark, listening to him breathe, every nerve ending firing. I was terrified he would touch me, and even more terrified that he wouldn't. This became the new ritual. The broken radiator was the excuse, the plausible deniability we both clung to. I called the landlord, of course, but it was the week before Christmas, and getting a repairman was proving to be impossible. So, night after night, Alex slept in my bed. We developed a silent choreography. He would take the side closest to the wall. I would take the side closest to the door. We would maintain a careful, respectful distance, a buffer zone of a few inches that felt as wide as a canyon. We never spoke of it in the morning. We would wake up, untangle ourselves from the sheets, and move into the kitchen to make coffee, the shared intimacy of the night before dissolving in the bright, unforgiving light of day. It was a secret we kept from ourselves, an experience that existed only in the dark. The tension of this new proximity was almost unbearable. It was a physical ache, a constant longing to close that small gap between us. I would lie awake, my back to him, and imagine what it would feel like to just roll over, to press my face into the warmth of his back, to slide my arm around his waist. The desire was so strong it felt like a physical force, a magnetic pull I had to actively resist. I was a cartographer mapping the borders of a forbidden country, learning every inch of the boundary line, but never daring to cross it. My internal monologue was a relentless loop of hope and despair. He was here, in my bed, choosing to be close to me. That had to mean something. But he was also careful, distant, always maintaining that sliver of space. That had to mean something, too. I felt like I was losing my mind, caught in a limbo of my own making. One night, lost in this agonizing internal debate, I must have made a sound, a small sigh of frustration. From behind me, his voice, thick with sleep, startled me. "You okay?" he murmured. My entire body went rigid. I thought he was fast asleep. "Yeah," I whispered back, my voice tight. "Just thinking." There was a long pause, and I could feel him shifting behind me. I felt the mattress move, felt the air stir. And then, I felt the light pressure of his hand on my shoulder. It was a simple, fleeting touch, probably meant to be reassuring, friendly. But to me, it was like a lit match dropped on a trail of gasoline. A wave of heat washed over me, so intense it made me dizzy. My carefully constructed composure shattered into a million pieces. "Leo," he said again, his voice a little clearer now, a note of concern in it. His hand was still there, a warm, heavy weight on my shoulder. I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. All the words I had swallowed for 10 years were rising in my throat, a bitter, choking tide. All the yearning, all the hope, all the fear. It was all right there, on the surface, and I knew if I turned around, if he saw my face, he would know everything. He would see the decade of love I had hidden behind the mask of friendship. And that terrified me more than anything. The touch lasted only a few seconds, but it rewired my entire nervous system. When he finally pulled his hand away, the absence of his touch was a physical pain, a cold spot on my skin that echoed the vast emptiness in my chest. He rolled away from me, and soon his breathing evened out into the steady rhythm of sleep. But I remained awake, staring into the darkness, feeling the ghost of his touch on my shoulder, a brand that marked the end of one chapter and the terrifying, uncertain beginning of another. That single touch shifted the landscape. The carefully maintained distance between us and the bed began to shrink, night by night, in increments so small they were almost imperceptible. It was an unconscious migration, a slow, gravitational pull in our sleep. I would wake up and find his leg resting against mine, or my hand would be resting on the pillow just inches from his head. And then came the night of the storm. Not a snowstorm this time, but a wild, violent thunderstorm that shook the building to its foundations. The power went out, plunging the apartment into an absolute, disorienting blackness. A clap of thunder directly overhead made the windows rattle, and in the sudden, echoing silence that followed, I heard him stir beside me. He made a small, startled sound, and in the next instant, he had moved. He rolled toward me, not away, and the space between us was gone. He was close, so close I could feel the warmth of his breath on my cheek. He wasn't touching me, not yet, but his presence was an overwhelming sensory experience in the pitch-black room. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I lay perfectly still, holding my breath, waiting. The moment stretched on, taut and fragile. Another crack of thunder, closer this time, and he flinched, a small, involuntary movement. And then his arm was around me, pulling me against his chest, his hand splayed across my back. He tucked my head under his chin, his body a solid, warm shield against the storm and the darkness. It was not a tentative gesture. It was firm, instinctual, protective. He held me as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And my body, which had been tense for months, finally relaxed. I melted into him, my own arm coming up to rest on his waist, my face pressed against the soft cotton of his t-shirt. It smelled of him, a scent I knew better than my own. I could feel the steady, reassuring beat of his heart against my ear. It was a slow, strong rhythm, a counterpoint to the wild chaos of the storm outside. In that moment, there were no questions, no analysis, no fear. There was only this incredible, profound sense of peace, of rightness. It felt like coming home to a place I had never been before. I had spent a decade dreaming of what this might feel like, and the reality of it was so much simpler, so much more profound than anything I could have ever imagined. He held me through the rest of the storm, his grip never slackening. And for the first time in a long time, I slept deeply and without dreams, anchored by his warmth in the roaring dark. The morning after the storm was bright and strangely quiet, the world outside washed clean. When I woke up, we were still tangled together. His arm was a heavy, comforting weight across my waist, our legs intertwined. The sun was streaming through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. For a few blissful seconds, I just existed in the moment, soaking in the feeling of his body pressed against mine. Then, reality began to seep in. He was going to wake up. He was going to realize what had happened, where he was, how he was holding me. And the ambiguity that had protected us for so long would be gone. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the edges of my contentment. I should move. I should untangle myself, retreat to my side of the bed, pretend it never happened. It was the safe thing to do, the thing that would preserve our friendship. But I couldn't. I was paralyzed by a stubborn, defiant hope. For once, I didn't want to be the one to retreat. I didn't want to be the one who rebuilt the wall. So I stayed. I watched his face in the morning light, the way his eyelashes cast long shadows on his cheeks. I watched the slight flutter of his eyelids as he began to surface from sleep. His brow furrowed slightly, and then his eyes opened. They were hazy at first, unfocused. They blinked once, twice, and then they found mine. For a long moment, we just looked at each other. There was no shock in his expression, no panic. Just a quiet, sleepy sort of recognition. He didn't pull away. If anything, his arm tightened around me for a fraction of a second. His gaze was steady, searching. It felt like he was seeing me, truly seeing me, for the first time. The silence was absolute, filled with everything we had never said. It was the most honest conversation we had ever had. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could feel it. This was the precipice. This was the moment where everything could change or everything could shatter. I could see the questions in his eyes, the confusion, but underneath it, there was something else. Something soft, something vulnerable. He swallowed, his gaze dropping to my lips for a fleeting second before returning to my eyes. The movement was so small, so quick, I almost thought I had imagined it. But I hadn't. It was a flicker of something new, a spark in the kindling we had been gathering for months. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a rough, morning whisper. It was barely audible, but it landed in the quiet room with the force of a thunderclap. "Leo," he said, his voice thick with sleep and something else I couldn't name. And then, after a pause that felt like a lifetime, he asked the question that would change everything. Would it be okay? He didn't have to specify what he was asking. I knew. We both knew. The question was a fragile bridge extended across the canyon that had separated us. All I had to do was take a step. All the fear, all the years of self-preservation, all the carefully constructed arguments for why this was a terrible idea, they all just evaporated. In their place was a simple, overwhelming certainty. I didn't trust myself to speak. The word I wanted to say was too big, too full of a decade of waiting. So I just nodded. A small, jerky movement. But it was enough. He leaned in slowly, giving me every possible chance to pull away, to change my mind. His eyes never left mine, and in them, I saw my own terrified hope reflected back at me. His lips were chapped and soft. The kiss was not passionate or demanding. It was a question. It was a confession. It was hesitant and gentle and unbelievably, breathtakingly real. It was the taste of coffee and sleep and 10 years of unspoken words. It was the single most terrifying and beautiful moment of my life. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. We stayed like that, breathing the same air, our hearts beating a frantic, mismatched rhythm. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full. It was the sound of a key finally turning in the lock. The door had been opened. The aftermath was not the explosion of joy and relief I might have fantasized about. It was quiet. It was confusing. After that first, world-altering kiss, we didn't talk about it. We got out of bed, made coffee, and moved through the morning with a strange, delicate formality, as if we were handling a piece of unexploded ordnance. We were intensely aware of each other, the air between us crackling with a new energy, but we avoided eye contact. The kiss hung in the room, a silent, shimmering question mark. I was desperate to talk, to define what had happened, to understand what it meant. But Alex was a closed book. He was quiet, withdrawn, his usual easygoing nature replaced by a tense, thoughtful stillness. He left for work that morning with a hurried, mumbled goodbye, and for the first time in months, he didn't come back that night. Or the next. My calls went to voicemail. My texts were answered with short, non-committal replies hours later. Busy at work, swamped with a project, the silence from him was a physical presence in my apartment. The space he had occupied, the warmth he had brought, was gone, replaced by a cold, hollow echo. The bed felt enormous and empty. The couch looked forlorn. My home, which had become our home, was just my home again, and the loneliness was crushing. Doubt, a cold and insidious poison, began to seep into my thoughts. Had I imagined it all? Had I misinterpreted a moment of sleepy, post-storm confusion? Was he straight? Had I pushed him into something he hadn't wanted, something that had now horrified him and driven him away? The kiss, which had felt so real, so mutual, began to feel like a figment of my hopeful imagination. I replayed the moment over and over, analyzing every detail. His question, would it be okay? It was permission, not initiation. Had I been the one to lead us there? The shame and fear were suffocating. I had done the one thing I had sworn I would never do. I had risked our friendship, and it seemed, with every passing hour of silence, that I had lost. After 4 days of this agonizing radio silence, I couldn't take it anymore. The uncertainty was eating me alive. I would rather have a definitive, painful ending than this slow, torturous fade to black. I drove to his apartment building, my hands slick with sweat on the steering wheel. I didn't have a plan. I just knew I had to see him, to force a conversation. I felt like a photographer walking into a pitch-black room, fumbling for the light switch, not knowing if I would find a beautiful scene or a complete disaster. I buzzed his apartment, my heart hammering against my ribs. For a long moment, there was no answer. I was about to give up, to turn around and accept defeat, when the speaker crackled to life. Yeah. His voice was flat, tired. It's me, I said, my own voice sounding thin and weak. Can I come up? The silence that followed was so long I thought he had hung up. Finally, the lock buzzed, a harsh, grating sound that made me jump. I pushed the heavy door open and walked into the sterile, impersonal lobby. The elevator ride up to the 7th floor felt like an ascent into the gallows. My mind was a whirlwind of rehearsed speeches and frantic apologies. When I reached his door, it was already slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The apartment was dark, the blinds drawn against the afternoon sun. It was neat and tidy, but it felt unlived in, like a hotel room. He was sitting on the edge of his perfectly made bed, staring at the floor. He didn't look up when I came in. I stood in the doorway, my hands shoved deep into my pockets. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. I was the one who had come here, so I was the one who had to speak. Alex, I started, my voice cracking slightly. We need to talk. He didn't move, didn't respond. He just kept staring at the floor, his shoulders slumped. He looked defeated. I took a deep breath and plunged ahead, the words tumbling out in a rush of fear and frustration. What happened? Why have you been avoiding me? If the other morning was a mistake, just tell me. If I misread everything, I'm sorry. I swear, I am so sorry. I never wanted to make you uncomfortable. I need you to say something. Anything. This silence is killing me. He finally looked up, and his eyes were full of a pain that mirrored my own. It wasn't a mistake, he said, his voice so quiet I could barely hear him. That's what scares me. That one sentence stopped me cold. It was not the rejection I had braced myself for. It was something far more complicated. I walked further into the room and sat on the corner of the desk chair, keeping my distance, giving him space. I don't understand, I said, and I was telling the truth. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of deep frustration. I don't either, Leo. That's the problem. He looked around his pristine, empty apartment. For the last 10 years, my life has been on a track. You know? Go to school, get a good job, meet a girl, get married. It was all laid out. A neat, straight line. And I was on it. I thought I was happy on it. He looked at me then, his gaze direct and filled with a raw, terrifying honesty. And then Sarah left, and my whole world just fell apart. I was lost. And I came to you. Because you're my best friend. You're my safe place. He stood up and began to pace the small space between the bed and the window, his movements agitated, restless. And it was safe. At first. But then, I don't know when it started, being at your place stopped feeling just like being with a friend. It started to feel like home, in a way that even my place with Sarah never really did. The quiet was different. It wasn't empty quiet. It was full. And I started needing it. I started needing to be there. With you, he stopped pacing and faced me, his expression a mixture of confusion and dawning realization. And that night, with the storm, I wasn't scared of the thunder, Leo. I was scared of how much I wanted to be close to you. And when I held you, it just felt right. It felt more right than anything has in a very long time. He took a shaky breath. And then we kissed. And it wasn't a mistake. I wanted to. I asked to. And in that moment, it was the only thing in the world that made sense. But then the sun came up, and the world came back, and that neat, straight line I'd been on my whole life was just gone. And I had no map. I had no idea who I was anymore. Because the man who wanted to kiss you, that's not the man I've always thought I was. He finally met my eyes, and his were shining with unshed tears. I got scared, he whispered. I got scared of what it meant. For me. For you. For us. So I ran. I came back here, to this empty box, and tried to force myself back onto the track. But it's gone. And I'm just lost. All the anger, all the hurt I had been feeling for the past 4 days just dissolved, washed away by a tidal wave of empathy. He wasn't rejecting me. He was terrified. He wasn't running from me. He was running from himself, from a truth so profound it had completely dismantled his understanding of his own life. I stood up and closed the distance between us. I didn't touch him. I just stood in front of him, forcing him to see me, to stay in the moment. Hey, I said softly. Look at me. He did, his gaze wavering. You're not lost, I said, my voice firmer now, filled with a certainty I didn't know I possessed. You're right here, and I'm right here. We don't need a map. I reached out and very gently took his hand. His fingers were cold, but they curled around mine instantly, his grip tight, desperate. Forget the track. Forget the straight line. What if it's not a line? What if it's just a room? And we just found the door to a new room. We can just stand here, in the doorway, for as long as you need. Or we can step inside. Together, a single tear escaped and traced a path down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He just stared at our joined hands as if they were a lifeline. I don't know how, he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. I don't know how to be. This person you don't have to know, I said, my thumb stroking the back of his hand. Neither do I. We can just be. We can just be us. Whatever that is. We can figure it out. But you can't run away. We have to talk. No more silence, he nodded, a shuddering breath escaping him. He squeezed my hand. Okay, he said. No more silence. It wasn't a perfect resolution. It wasn't a declaration of love under a shower of fireworks. It was something far more real. It was a promise. A beginning. It was two people, terrified and confused, agreeing to be brave together. And in the quiet darkness of his apartment, that felt like more than enough. It felt like everything. We didn't go back to my place that night. We stayed at his, a silent acknowledgement that this was his space, his crisis, and I was there to meet him in it, not to pull him back into my own orbit. We ordered pizza and sat on the floor, the awkwardness from before replaced by a fragile, tentative peace. We talked for hours. Not about us, not directly. We talked about our fears, our futures, the pressures we felt from our families and from ourselves. He spoke about the rigid definition of masculinity he had grown up with, the unspoken rules of being an athlete. A guy's guy. He admitted he'd never felt like he fully fit the mold, that he'd always felt like he was playing a part. I talked about my own loneliness, the feeling of being an observer on the sidelines of life, my camera a shield that both connected me to the world and kept me separate from it. It was the most honest we had ever been, stripping away the layers of performance we had both perfected over the years. We were just Leo and Alex, two men trying to find their way in the dark. When it was late, we moved to his bed. It was a king-sized bed, much larger than mine, but we lay close, facing each other. There was no pretense this time, no accidental, sleepy migration. It was an intentional act of closeness. He reached for my hand under the covers, his fingers lacing with mine. "I'm still scared," he admitted into the darkness. "Me too," I confessed. And that shared admission was a comfort in itself. We weren't pretending to have the answers. We were just agreeing to face the questions together. He didn't kiss me again that night. But in a way, this was more intimate. It was a conscious choice to be vulnerable, to stay present in the uncertainty without needing to rush toward a conclusion. It was the quiet work of laying a new foundation, brick by painstaking brick, on the ground where the old one had crumbled. The days that followed were a process of gentle rediscovery. We were learning a new language, a new way of being with each other. The old, easy camaraderie of our friendship was still there, but it was now threaded with something new, a tender awareness that was both exhilarating and nerve-wracking. Every touch was freighted with meaning. A hand on the small of my back as I passed him in the kitchen, his fingers brushing mine as he handed me a coffee mug. These small gestures were the vocabulary of our new relationship, quiet affirmations that the connection between us was real and growing. We took it slow, at a pace he could handle. We were like two people learning to walk again after a long illness, hesitant at first, but gaining strength and confidence with each step. I started staying at his place more often, leaving my own quiet apartment behind. We were slowly, carefully, merging our lives. I brought over my favorite mug, then a stack of books, then a spare camera. He cleared a drawer for me in his dresser without me having to ask. It was a small thing, but it felt monumental. It was an invitation. It was him carving out a permanent space for me in his life, not just as a temporary refuge, but as a resident. I watched him begin to relax, the tense, worried lines around his eyes softening. He started to smile again, his real smile, the one that reached his eyes. It was like watching a photograph develop in a darkroom, the image slowly emerging from the murky chemicals, gaining clarity and definition. The man I had always loved was still there, but a new version of him was coming into focus, one that was more honest, more open, more whole. About a week after our talk, we were cooking dinner together in his kitchen. It was a simple, domestic scene, the kind of quiet moment I had only ever allowed myself to dream about. I was chopping vegetables, and he was stirring a sauce on the stove. I glanced over at him, and he was watching me, a soft, contemplative look on his face. He put the spoon down and walked over to me. He gently took the knife from my hand and set it on the counter. Then he framed my face with his hands, his thumbs stroking my cheekbones. He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes searching mine. "I'm not scared anymore," he said, his voice quiet but sure. And then he kissed me. This kiss was different from the first. It was not a hesitant question. It was a statement. It was full of a month of confusion and fear and a week of quiet rediscovery. It was sure of itself. It was a promise. It was the feeling of a door not just being unlocked, but being thrown wide open, revealing a room filled with sunlight. In the end, that's what love felt like. Not a lightning strike or a grand, dramatic gesture. It felt like coming home. It felt like safety. It was the quiet, profound peace of being seen, truly and completely, by the one person whose opinion of you mattered more than anyone else's. It was the feeling of his hand in mine, a simple, solid anchor in the unpredictable currents of life. It was the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together, a silence that was no longer empty, but filled with a decade of friendship and the promise of a lifetime of love. We had found our way out of the darkness, not by finding a map, but by learning to navigate by the light we found in each other. And we began to heal, to build, to love, in the quiet, certain space that was finally, truly, ours.